Hello and welcome to the India Energy Hour. I am Sandeep Pai, a former journalist with Hindustan Times and now an energy researcher at the University of British Columbia.
And I'm Shreya Jay, journalist with Business Standard newspaper in Delhi, writing on the energy sector.
Together, we are really excited to co host a new podcast on India's energy transition, the India Energy Hour. This podcast is hosted by 101 Reporters, an innovative news agency that connects grassroots reporters and media houses to bring out untold stories. The show is produced by Tejas Dayan and Sagar of 101 Reporters.
In this podcast, we want to unpack and document India's energy transition. We will interview leading energy, development, and climate experts from academia, civil society, and the government. Through these interviews, we will explore the most pressing hurdles and promising opportunities in the energy transition unfolding in India. We will examine the role of government, finance, social justice, and science. Over time, we will feature other countries of the global south as well.
Globally, nearly 2.8 billion people depend on solid fuels such as firewood and biomass for their cooking needs, and nearly 1 billion people live without electricity connection. Majority of such people lacking basic energy access reside in African and Asian countries including India. In the last 2 decades, India has made substantial progress in enhancing energy access through policies that support greater use of LPG cylinders and by expanding the electricity grid. However, several issues still remain. To understand the Indian and global energy access challenge and the required interventions, we interviewed two renowned energy access experts: Shalu Agrawal, program lead at the Council on Energy, Environment and Water, and Dr. Hisham Zerriffi, associate professor at the University of British Columbia. Over the years, both Shalu and Hisham have independently led numerous studies on energy access in India and in other countries. This is our first episode with two guests. Before we begin, an important disclaimer. Hisham is my PhD supervisor at the University of British Columbia. We hope you enjoy the episode.
Okay, so thank you for joining us, Shalu and Hisham. It's great to have you both. This is the first time that we are having two guests at our podcast, and it is very exciting for us to have you both. Energy access is a very important topic, and we can't wait to dwell right into it. But let's just first start with the introduction. Shalu, can you just tell us a little bit about yourself? Where are you from? What did you study? How did you land into this particular sector? And also, what in energy access interests you so much that you have done such brilliant work in it?
Thanks, Shreya, and thanks, Sandeep, both of you for having me here and inviting me to Energy Hour. It's my pleasure and honor to be on this platform along with Hisham. And as for my story, I'm from Uttar Pradesh in India. I was born and brought up in a town called Mathura. It's also famously known as the land of Lord Krishna, and is one of the seven sacred cities in Hinduism. So I grew up in a very interesting environment. It was a joint family setup with many fun festivals, full of colors, music, food. But of course, growing up in a small town also meant, one had to often rebel as a girl to seek small freedoms, going out alone with friends in the evening or wearing clothes of choice. But fortunately, education was something that I got a lot of support for from my family as well as freedom for. So I was the first person and the girl in my family to do an engineering from an IIT, which suddenly exposed me to a very different world. And my background of growing up in Mathura, where we used to see a lot of access related challenges. I mean, I didn't decide to work on access as a child, but those experiences were very real, right? Facing parkets for hours and hours, 8 hours, or even, sometimes for days, and studying in, besides the candlelight and all. I mean, these are stories that I report on, but I've also lived through them. But anyways, studying in IIT gave a great exposure. And even as I was taking lessons in electrical and power engineering, I had started to also observe like how many people, just lack access. We have a lot of technological solutions at our hand, but not everyone has them. So I also started thinking about we need to have more efforts to take those to the people at scale. And in a developing country like India, implementation at scale is generally the forte of the government. So I initially decided to pursue civil services. And as I was preparing for it, for the exam, it also, exposed me to a whole new literature on sustainable development and the role of public policy. So, I mean, there were multiple things coming together, and it was also the time when solar had started to gain a lot of policy traction in India. I mean, 2012, 14, right? So when civils didn't happen for me, which I think was fortunate now, I started looking for an opportunity to work on sustainable development, and that's when I came across CEW and I started to work as a researcher with them. And into my first job, I was got the opportunity to answer very interesting questions. Like the first one that I was looking at was how big can India go on renewables, and how much money would we need for that? And very incidentally, that work got the traction of the PM's office when the new national government had come to the power and was looking to ramp up India's solar ambition. So, of course, there was a lot of advisories happening at that time. But as a new researcher, you sort of start to feel the impact that evidence-based research can have on shaping public policies, and really convinced me to pursue a career in energy policy research. So since then, I've been, working. I've worked on various issues, like how to scale up solar irrigation in a sustainable manner, how to reform our energy subsidy regime and target them to the right beneficiaries. So incidentally, a lot of my work had this element of, distributive justice and, addressing the equity issues, pertaining to energy access. So I went for a master's after that. I studied at University College London. There again, I had the opportunity to work with Professor Yacob Mulugeta. And we were together trying to answer how could Ethiopia leverage solar irrigation to overcome food security challenge. So, I mean, again, a lot of things were coming together. So after my master's, I got this opportunity, to work very directly on energy access, and had could design and run the survey that we'll talk about. So it was, I think, a combination of inclination, history, and right opportunities that got me here.
That's really, really fascinating. I mean, your journey is really interesting because you have some lived experience, and I think most kids like us who have grown up in India in those days have studied, next to a candle. And I mean, in those days, I used to really enjoy playing with the candle, but it's kind of you think about it and you reflect that later, which is really interesting. Great. So let's move on to Hisham. I mean, so Hisham is my supervisor, of course, as I said before in the podcast while introducing him. So when I actually came to do my PhD, I actually approached Hisham to study energy access. It's a different story that I am now studying completely different stuff. But because Hisham's lab and many of the students in the lab study energy access, I have sort of been at the horizons of this topic, learning about different people's. And so it has been a very big learning experience for me. And so, I really think Hisham is truly a global expert on this topic. And so I think it would be great to know your journey, your story. Some of it I know, but I think our listeners would love to know, how did you get interested in this topic, and what did you study, and what's your real story, and how did you become an expert on this topic?
Well, thank you for that very generous introduction, and it is really a great pleasure to be on this podcast with the three of you. So I guess I don't know how far you want to go back. It's been a meandering journey. So if you want on the personal side, I was born in Morocco. I have one Moroccan parent, my father, and an American parent, my mother. And in addition to having parents from two different nationalities, they come from two different religious traditions. So my father comes from a Muslim family, my mother from a Jewish family, which jokingly by religious law makes me both 100% Muslim and 100% Jewish, because one goes from the father, one goes from the mother. But we then immigrated to Canada when I was very young, 3.5. So I grew up in Canada for the most part, and typical Canadian immigrant experience in many, many ways. With my father working all different kinds of jobs, my mother working on all different kinds of jobs to make a life for us in this country. So then I eventually, I won't get into the whole story of how I ended up there. I went to a very small school in the United States initially to study both physics and religion. I wanted to be a cosmologist. I wanted to study the origins of the universe, and I wanted to study the origins of the universe from a physics perspective, but I also wanted to understand people's stories about how the universe started, which is usually through religion. And so I was studying both of those, but I was also I was politically active. I've always had a political interest in politics. I'm going to date myself now. This is right sort of end of the Cold War, early 90s. And I, in my third year, I had a bit of a crisis of what do I do? Because I kind of felt like I was loving the physics that I was studying and the religion that I was studying, but I felt like I could do something different with my life with those skills. And so I dropped down to a religion minor instead of a major, and I added in a political science, a more international relations type minor, because I felt like one of the things I was really interested in is what was happening with the end of the Cold War, and the world was awash in nuclear weapons, and what was going to happen with that. And physics was something, since I had physics, maybe I could do something that worked more on nuclear stuff. So I got a fellowship to go work at a really small NGO run by Dr. Arjun Makhijani, who is originally from India. And that was really amazingly eye-opening for me. This was a small nonprofit where we really did kind of technical work around nuclear issues, particularly around the health and environmental effects of nuclear weapons production, but working really closely with community organizations, both in the United States. This is just outside Washington, D.C. we were based, as well as around the world. And so working with people who had for many years not known that, for example, there was uranium in their well water from the local uranium processing facility for the weapons complex, right? And as well as, and you had people who were like that in like rural Ohio, but then you also had these like very progressive lefty activist groups around often around like from the Bay Area around the nuclear labs. And it was a really interesting, fascinating group of people to really work with. And I learned a lot about kind of the importance of working with communities and working with people and respecting the knowledge that they bring and the experiences that they bring. Even though I was supposedly the technical expert, I had an undergraduate degree in physics, right? But I was a technical expert. I did go back and get a master's of applied chemistry, went back and working for the same organization. I'm now sit on their board, in fact. But after a few years, I decided I wanted to go back and get my PhD for a whole host of reasons. Did not intend to be an academic. Told my PhD supervisor I had no intention of being an academic. I was not here to do that. I was here to get my PhD. I was going to go and I was going to do a bunch of other interesting things. That, of course, didn't quite work out the way I intended. And so I did my PhD in engineering and public policy. And I really was looking at questions around the reliability of decentralized electric power systems versus centralized electric power systems when those systems were under really high stress conditions. I initially started thinking about this in conflict areas, when the power system itself becomes a target of conflict, of war. I was thinking about places like Yugoslavia, the Gaza Strip, places like I actually spent 3 months during my PhD in the Palestinian territories, interviewing people in the Palestinian Energy Authority and other people like that. To understand the situation better. But it also applied to places where, for financial and other reasons, the power system was just not well maintained. Places like rural India, right? And for a whole host of reasons, that PhD ended up being all mathematical modeling. It's all done in MATLAB. Modeling the reliability of these different types of centralized systems and then adding stress into the reliability models to see what happened and whatnot. But I was like, this is not really what I wanted to do. And so I convinced through my supervisor, I met my supervisor was two supervisors, Alex Farrell, and who passed away, and Hadi Dawlatabadi, who is also here at University of British Columbia now, but back then was at Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh. And they introduced me to a professor at Stanford by the name of David Victor. And David took a flying leap of faith on me and gave me a postdoc and just said, go do what you want to do, which was I wanted to study the reasons why, despite the fact, even at that time, so this is about 2004, at that time, the landscape around, the quote unquote developing world was littered with failed small scale energy projects, with some successful ones, but lots of failures. And the question I was asking myself was, why? I mean, we knew the technology, it wasn't the technology, right? And so I was convinced it was basically institutions and business models. And so he gave me 2 years to go around the world, and I went to Cambodia and Brazil and India and China, a bunch of other places, to try to get information about all these various systems and try to understand what was going on, why were some of them successful and some of them failing. And that was a fascinating 2 years. I ended up in the book that I wrote on rural electrification. And then I came to UBC. I got a professorship here at UBC, where I've been since 2006, continuing to work on energy access. And one of my early PhD students, Reza Kausari, got involved in a project in India. And I also got involved in a different project in India through some other colleagues of mine. And that just really started my time spent working in India. And so I spent over a decade, working on and running projects on energy access in India, both initially, I continue to be mainly around clean cooking and cook stoves. But it's funny, sometimes I go back and I think back, I don't have, I grew up in Canada. I grew up with a house with, electricity that was pretty reliable. Except if there was a bad thunderstorm. And I grew up in a house where, we had multiple cooking devices and they worked and you just turned them on and they weren't spewing stuff into our house. But then I think back to, going back to Morocco sometimes and thinking back to my grandmother, for example, when people talk about, people can just switch, right? And people will just, cook with gas, they can cook with this and all that. And we talk about sometimes in the work that we do about behavior and behavior change and norms and customs and culture around food and everything. And I think back to my grandmother. I came from a pretty wealthy family back in Morocco. My parents gave all that up when they moved to Canada, a lot. But my family back in Morocco was pretty wealthy. And so if I went to go visit my grandparents, it was in a big house, and with a full modern kitchen. And yet, my grandmother, if she was cooking certain foods, particularly kebabs, I remember, well, that had to be done over charcoal. And so she would go to the front hall foyer and open the window and open the back patio window to let the breeze go through. She'd pull out her little stool and she'd sit there and she'd cook these. There was a range. There was a gas stove in the kitchen, worked perfectly fine, but no, right? And so, I think back to those times. I think back to the fact that the bread was always, always fresh. And the bread was always fresh because she would prepare dough, like I said, they're rich. They had a couple maids. One of the maids would prepare dough very early in the morning. Before I was even up, that dough would be collected by somebody who went around the neighborhood, who would take it to a wood-fired bakery down the street, right, where it would get baked and brought back to our house, and it makes a difference, right? And so I think, while I never grew up with those kinds of experiences of the day-to-day of it, I think back on it, and that's, and the strength of sort of those practices, right? And how persistent they are. And that has often affected sort of how I think about that. So, I guess in terms of my own work around this, it's been that combination of thinking about community and thinking about the people in those communities, and way back to my early history of working with communities, and then through thinking about the agency of people and what it is that they want, right? And that's what's driven a lot of my work.
That's an amazing introduction to the topic itself. You mentioned about behavior there. That plays a great role, I believe, in energy access. Even if you provide people with a lot of options, as you said, their behavior or the culture of food dynamics actually does impact access to energy. So let me now then quickly ask the first question to you, that what do you think about energy access challenge around the world? It is considered to be a cornerstone of development in economies. So if you can describe to us between clean cooking and access to electricity while explaining the challenge to energy access.
Okay, so let's start with electricity. It's not that hard to sort of distill down that challenge, because what you have is an infrastructure, which is, if you do it the way it has been done for decades in the OECD, the richer economies, that's large centralized infrastructure, right? It's big power plants, it's power lines, it's distribution lines. Well, that stuff is really expensive, right? And in order to make that work, you need to have a certain density of demand and people who can afford to pay for that electricity. You don't have that in large parts of the world, right? And so at the same time, you also, even in urban areas, sometimes simply don't have the affordability question comes into play for whether people can afford the electricity or whatnot. So what do you have? You have about 1 billion people almost who don't have access to electricity, right? You've got another, and the numbers range quite widely, but at least 1 billion. I'm going to say at least 1 billion more who have access to very unreliable electricity, right? Because it's not just a technological problem, it's an institutional problem. And so the institutions that have been set up for electricity in many countries are just not fit for purpose. And so we end up with really bad reliability problems. And so that is sort of the core of the challenge around electricity, is how do you make electricity available to people when they are far from the existing infrastructure, very dispersed, low densities, low affordability, right? And so that's the core of that problem in many ways. The core of the cooking problem is different, right? Because the technologies are not necessarily all that expensive. Sure, piped gas is expensive, potentially, right? But an LPG stove is not terribly expensive, and yet it still remains unaffordable, right? So it's not terribly expensive for us, but when we're talking about, again, rural low-income communities in sub-Saharan Africa and rural India, right? That that stove initially is expensive, and the refills, the purchase of the fuel, and you're comparing it often against what is a monetarily free fuel, right? It's go out and collect dung, go out and collect agricultural residues, go out and collect wood, right? And so that's a really tough ask for low-income households to say, go from this thing, which is monetarily free, and go to this thing where you have to actually use your limited budgetary resources in order to change that, right? And we get into all kinds of questions around, that brings us into all kinds of really complicated questions around intra-household equity and decision-making, and who in the household is affected and who in the household has the decision-making authority. It brings us into behavior change around food and food customs. Here's even a really, really simple one. If you come from a community in which you have seen everybody in front of you cook squatting down on the floor, LPG requires the stove be elevated up above the gas cylinder in order to be safe. That means you have to A, build a counter, because you may not have a counter in your kitchen, and B, have people stand up to cook, which is something that they've never done. Their mother never did, their grandmother never did, right? So that behavior change becomes really, really important as well. And so I actually think that in many ways, the clean cooking problem is actually harder than the electricity problem. And that's why we see still 2.5 billion people who rely on biomass for cooking and heating, and there's another number who rely on burning coal, right? It's a tough problem, right? And it's not one that's easy to solve just by saying we're going to build a bunch of infrastructure, because you're not going to build a bunch of infrastructure. The electricity problem is half of the electricity problem is going to get solved by building big infrastructure. It's going to be build out more generation, build out more transmission, build out more distribution. The other half is going to get solved by people adopting off-grid type technology, solar home systems, mini grids, and stuff like this. That's tough. That's challenging. That I've worked on as well, right? But the cooking one is really where it gets very, very tricky, right? Because the other thing is a lot of people can see the benefit of electricity. Light, cell phone charging. I mean, they television. They understand that benefit, right? The benefit of clean cooking, much, much harder, right? Oh, you want me to spend a whole bunch of money now so I don't get sick 10 years from now? Wait a minute. That's a tough sell, right? So, I mean, that's why I think, both of them are challenging in their own way, but they're both huge global priorities that are underappreciated, right? Tell most people the fact that 1 billion people can't go home and flick a light switch and have lights turn on, and they're stunned, right? Here in Canada, we love to camp. A lot of people love to camp. I like camping. I camp. One of the things I do I do in my classes is I take a poll. I say to my students, okay, how many of you go camping? A bunch of them say, oh yeah, I go camping. And you say, okay, how many of you have a nice fire when you go camping? Oh yeah, I like have a fire when I go camping. Okay, great. How many of you hate it when the wind turns and that smoke is blowing right in your face? Yeah, that's really bad. Okay, now imagine that every single day just so you can get food on the table, right? Like, that's what we're talking about.
That's really great, and that's a really foundational piece into how different both challenges are grand, but how different they are, and it's very multidisciplinary. Let's come to Shalu and come to India. I mean, so Shalu, let me brag a little bit about you. I mean, you, first of all, like there are very few women in Indian energy space. So it is a remarkable deal that you're doing such great work in this space. But coming to the question that we're discussing about energy access and progress, I mean, you led a massive pan India survey called the India Residential Energy Survey 2020, where we basically focused on understanding energy access and consumption patterns in human households. Can you describe, like, in detail about like what the survey was, what the process was, what did you find? Where is this grand challenge of electricity access and cooking access? Like, where does it stand in the Indian context? And what did you find?
Thanks, Sandeep. I think part of the credit goes to the fact that I had the opportunity to design and lead such a survey. For our listeners, I would just like to clarify that India Residential Energy Survey, or IRES in short as we call it, it covered nearly 15,000 households across 21 most populous states in India. So we tried to make it a nationally representative survey, and it, a team of around 154 enumerators, supervised by 40, regional managers, and a team of 6 researchers was behind this whole effort. So they went to nearly 1,800 villages and wards spread across 150 districts and talked to these 15,000 households for almost, time ranging between 30 minutes to an hour to understand, what is the state of cooking, electricity access in their homes, how are they using energy, how much are they spending, what are the challenges, their satisfaction levels, as well as, we try to cover more futuristic issues as well, like, they were about smart prepaid meters, they were about energy efficiency, what are the challenges in accessing these as well. And the objective of the survey really was to, one, take stock of how far has India come when it comes to energy access, but also, how prepared are we for the coming decade? Because I think 2020 is really, 2021 is now a very, it's sort of an inflection point that we can proudly say we have, overcome many of the energy access challenges. Of course, there are a lot of concerns that remain, but we have to, at the same time, while fulfilling those challenges, prepare for the new ones, that we are shaping our demand while we are meeting people's demand in an efficient, affordable, as well as sustainable manner. So that was really the context behind it. And the survey preparation, rollout, and data cleaning, etc. It spanned around 18 months time, I think. So it was definitely a very a steep learning curve for all of us. We were all trying to take inspiration from the work done by many of the researchers in India and outside to see how we can design a survey. And this was one of its kind survey done at the national level. So and for our listeners' benefit, we'll be soon making the data public as well, so that it can benefit everyone. Now coming to the other questions of what we find from the survey, I'll again talk about electricity first, and then cooking energy, because that does happen to be a more complex problem to solve for. So on the electricity front, as you find from our survey, 97% of Indian homes have now an electricity connection, and this is a massive upturn, from just 2001, for instance, when electrification rates were only 60%. So literally, millions of people have been brought out of darkness over the past 2 decades, and they've been able to give away their kerosene wicks and similar polluting sources of lighting. So, not just, use of biomass for cooking, but even use of kerosene or, other suboptimal lighting products also affected human health, or even the quality of lighting that they were getting access to. And this transition has been largely possible because of, the massive public investment that's been happening over the years in extending the grid infrastructure to every nook and corner in the country. And the Subhagya scheme, which was launched in 2017, it gave the sort of final push for household electrification, under which almost 26 million households were electrified in 2 years. So it was literally electrification at an electrifying pace that was happening. And these drives did try to overcome, 3 key barriers to electricity access that, earlier studies had highlighted. That was high connection fee, lack of infrastructure in the vicinity, or, various administrative challenges in getting the connection. And of course, distributed renewables, as even Hisham talked about, plays an important role, particularly in, that was a choice that Indian government took, that we will electrify remote rural areas where the grid extension was difficult with DRE solutions. It could have been tried at larger scale as well, but they decided to, grid electrify most of the households and limited distributed renewables only to, these remote rural geographies. And I personally happened to trek in a forest, a few months back in the district that I'm living in, Rajasthan, and was pleased to find a small hamlet where, each of the household had a small solar home system. And the beauty is, of course, these are very poor households, and I think it meets most of their energy requirement at present, and it's affordable for them because they don't have to pay regularly, because that happens to be one of the biggest challenges in answering the remaining questions. How do you sustain the electrification gains that India has recently made? Because we do see, even from our survey, almost 0.5% of households, they lost their electricity connection because they couldn't pay for it. Over the past 1.5 years, the pandemic would have worsened the economic situation for many households. And even before that, we have been observing that many discoms in India have very low payment rates from, especially from newly collected households who do not have the capacity to pay. So, while electrification is done, a lot of discoms are trying to figure out this issue of how to make sure that everyone is able to pay. So this affordability concern remains. And of course, the other challenge on electricity access front is, of course, supply. Here as well, we find on an average, Indian household receives 20 hours of power supply on a daily basis. I would love to hear what Hisham's, power cut number would be like, in a month, how many power cuts do you get? We are talking about a daily power cut of almost 4 hours a day. And of course, in certain states, rural consumers have to deal with power cuts of even 6 to 8 hours a day. And these disruptions are partly linked to the quality of distribution network, but also partly linked to the poor financial health of the utilities, who are almost forced to, shed the load during peak hours because they can't buy expensive power because, they can't fully recover the cost of supply. So going forward, these, the affordability challenge, the supply related issue, and of course the institutional governance structure, that can supply electricity in an efficient manner. These are the three issues that remain to be solved. Coming to the cooking energy axis, and as Hisham also described, this is definitely a more complex puzzle to solve. Here as well, India has made a significant progress. In 2001, more than 80% Indian households relied on solid fuels for cooking, and LPG was just a urban affair, with 65% households in urban India using LPG. So India spent initially a lot of money on promoting improved cookstoves and biogas plants, particularly in rural areas. But often these programs didn't yield sustainable results, and most solutions went into disuse because of poor upkeep or lack of service support. So the effort then, was, sort of focused on LPG as well, LPG going forward. And here, lack of distribution infrastructure, the high cost of connection and refills, as well as, freely available biomass, meant that most Indians were happily enjoying food cooked on chula. So, it was about how do you take LPG to everyone, to those who want it, but also to those who don't want it. So over the past decade, there's been a lot of top-down push to promote LPG adoption through consumption subsidies and investment in expanding the distribution network. Under the Ujjwala scheme, again, which was launched around 2016-17, 80 million new LPG connections have been given. And again, a massive countrywide effort, which was accompanied by, very strong IEC campaign, consumer engagement, LPG panchayats happening in villages, and, people being told about the benefits of LPG and how to use it. And our survey suggests that, because of all these efforts that have been going on, the share of households relying on polluting fuels has come down to 30%. So from 80% in 2001 to 30% in 2020 is again a big transition. And this 30%, I'm talking about people who rely on biomass as a primary cooking fuel. Of course, there are more people who use it, who stack biomass with their LPG, which is a phenomenon known as fuel stacking. So again, the issues that remain in the cooking space to solve for are again affordability, availability, and that behavior change problem. So there are delays in getting a LPG refill, which is also quite costly. It's only rational for people to optimize their budgets by using freely available biomass. And of course, there is a strong preference for chula cooked food, biomass cooked food in many rural parts. So changing such age-old habits and tastes take time. And I think it will slowly happen. I'm sure, even our parents or grandparents had that preferences, but they have overcome them. And I think it happens, more and more you're exposed to the benefits of LPG, and women's agency in the household improves, and they find more opportunities to work outside, or there's a higher opportunity cost for their time. I think those factors come together and drive the uptake of clean fuels over. And just the awareness drives are not going to make the cut, because I think research also suggests that awareness often sort of comes after people start experiencing the benefits of it, rather than adopting a clean fuel because it seems good to adopt. So in summary, India has made visible strides in resolving a good share of the supply side barriers, and going forward, I think a greater focus will be required in shaping the demand and making energy more affordable.
Great, you mentioned about women, because that was something that I wanted to ask. If we can address this question of energy access from the prism of gender, because usually women are the first line of impact that they face because of lack of energy access, be it energy or be it cooking supplies. If you can tell us, from your survey, what was your observations across rural and urban households that lack of energy access has on the women folk, and during this time period that you have observed that the several schemes have come in, has that led to any kind of impact on women, how it leads to their development? Basically, if you can elaborate on the point that you just mentioned, that how it brings not only just a behavioral but a social change also in the households.
Right. So I think, of course, I mean, any improvement in energy access brings a lot of benefits to all members of the family, right? Directly, indirectly. Women, because in Indian context, happen to spend majority of their time within homes. Fortunately, unfortunately, are of course most exposed to the lack of access, or to the pollution associated with the use of biomass. So as of course, if we are talking about temporal change, as electricity access has improved, as cooking energy access has improved, while I have not actually done any systematic evaluation, and there studies out there, but there's been a lot of benefit that women have reaped, as well as children, in terms of ability to do more productive work at home, ability to you know study at for longer hours. And I mean, of course, the benefits of these changes, they are spread over time, and they are not easily visible within a year or two's time. So that's why they're difficult to measure through the traditional RCT or randomized control methods. Often studies discount the benefits, saying that no visible improvement is there. But even from personal experience of visiting, I mean, every single unit of improvement in hours of supply is comfort, it's better health, and it's an opportunity to do something better with that extra electrons flowing to your house. From the gender dynamics perspective, I think again, if you don't have to go and collect firewood from nearby places, it's a lot of reduced drudgery. I don't think it's fun in any form. While enjoying a bonfire can be a fun, collecting firewood certainly isn't, and carrying it on your head, for instance, and that too in scorching heat and horrible extreme climate sometimes. So those benefits are happening, and we also see a little. I mean, from our survey, we didn't we didn't focus a lot on the gender balance per se, but we do see that there's also a shift happening in the way the share of firewood collection is distributed within the family members. So earlier surveys and studies, I mean, this was exclusively women's in the women's domain, but we do observe more and more male members of the family are also taking this share. And I think partly it's because of the fact that biomass availability is also becoming a bit of a challenge. So you have to go to farther distances to get it. So it's not necessarily a benevolent change that we are seeing, but people have to also struggle to get biomass. And I think that's one of the major drivers for LPG uptake in urban and peri-urban areas, because biomass availability is not there, free biomass is not available, the cost is increasing. So people it's you have to spend more time as well as money to gather that. So it's better than you use LPG. So I think it's a combination of factors which are changing the women's well-being associated with energy access.
Yeah, thanks. Hisham, would you like to pitch in what has been your observation over the years of your research? What kind of social change in societies or in households we see with the availability of energy access solutions available now?
I want to actually just start by saying one thing, which is that I have such a huge amount of respect for the work that CEW does. They're one of my favorite organizations in India. I'm currently doing in a project using one of the prior versions of this survey, or the India Access Survey, collaborating with a couple of Shalu's colleagues at CEW, but have long just admired the work that CEW does. And so, for those of you who are listening, this is an organization you should be familiar with, because I feel it's one of the premier. It's one of the younger organizations in India working in this space, but one of the premier ones. And so I just wanted to say that it's a great pleasure to be on this podcast with Shalu for that reason. But with regard to the issue of gender, I think there's one thing that we kind of need to be aware of, which is that the change in energy access does have an impact, I think, on women's sort of day-to-day life to a certain degree. So certainly if you're reducing the amount of time you need to go collect, or the number of trips you have to do in a week for collection of firewood because you have access to LPG and you can afford some LPG, for example. Or if you're talking about particularly, girls of a certain age where they're starting to be the ones who are collecting, but at the same time they're at school, so that that cuts into their education time. So that has a huge kind of a huge impact. And on the electricity side as well, you start seeing a number of things where there's a potential for impact. But we have to also be a little bit cautious, because I don't think that in many cases, in many ways, those impacts can really truly be felt without a number of other changes happening within rural India. So, it's great if there's less time being spent on fuel collection, but often for many women, that's just shifted into other housework. That's shifted into other care work. Sometimes it's shifted into getting a little bit more sleep at night, which is always helpful because let's face it, women have another poverty problem. It's time poverty, right? There's so many tasks. And so I think that one of the reasons in many ways that and Shalu was spot on by saying that there's so many of these studies which don't find an effect of electrification, don't find an effect of clean cooking on this, whatever measure this study happens to have. Well, often those measures are very, very narrow. They're very traditional ways of measuring some impact, like changes in income, right? But they don't take into account the fact that you have to have all those other complementary things happening within rural India, right? At the same time, right? So it's not just about changing energy access. It's about changing access to educational opportunities. It's about changing access to economic opportunities, right? It's all these things which would then allow for you to be able, and it's a chicken and egg thing. Those things can't happen in some ways until women have to spend less time doing these other tasks as well, right? But we can't see it in isolation, right? And whether that's the cooking front or the electricity front, right? So one of the things that we've been challenged with is always thinking about how many households have access to this, how many households have access to electricity. And when it becomes this binary thing of like, oh, look, we have X number of households, and India has done a fabulous job on this. Absolutely, right? The numbers have gone up and that is great. But until we see energy in rural India as part of a larger rural development program, right, in which we're transforming rural economies and rural lives in ways that the people within those places want, not imposed from the outside. Until we have that, we're still going to continue to see, at least in the short term, very limited impacts on people's lives in a way that we tend to think is going to happen when we bring electricity to the village, right? It doesn't work that way, right? It doesn't work that way if you don't have the ability to get your crops to market, or they spoil because you don't have refrigeration in the village at the same time, because you focused on electrifying households and not electrifying communities, not electrifying, what people need at the same time. So that's just my caveat on all of this, whether, in terms of thinking about this whole issue of impact on women, right? Yes, absolutely. But there's another really big, piece of it that has to happen at the same time if we really want to see the impact.
Just to add to what Hisham said, I think that also underpins the solving for the ultimate question: how do we sustain the gains that we have made so far? That people's affordability to pay for energy is also linked to their ability to use energy for productive purposes. Because unless they're also, their incomes are rising, if simply the consumption rises, they will not be able to sort of pay for it. So, and that's why, I mean, it will underpin all these issues: the ability of women to make productive use of their time, and which in turn is linked to how much are we create the kind of ecosystem we are creating in the rural areas that supports the use of energy for developmental purposes.
Yeah, I mean, so I couldn't agree more. In the book I alluded to that I wrote a number of years ago, Rural Electrification, I had sort of a few big kind of conclusions in there, kind of stylized ideas. And one of them was electrons are not development, right? Just having electrons is not enough. It's what you use those electrons for. And one of the biggest factors when I looked at this is going back a while now, but when I looked at the success and failure of these distributed electric power system schemes in various places around the world, one of the two of the big things that were at play were did it facilitate productive activity? Number one, and the other one was there the ability to maintain and service these systems over time? So many of them were like, oh, we'll just go in and dump a solar system and walk away. And then 5 years later, well, guess what? The inverter's not working. And so that was a nice white elephant. But, it didn't do anything ultimately, right? Because you didn't put into place the mechanisms by which you can maintain that supply of energy. And part of that has to do with these things cost money. It's just, you can't get around. They cost money. The money's got to come from somewhere, right?
That's great.
Wow, I was just enjoying your back and forth between you two on this really interesting topic. So I guess one thing that I'm getting a sense of, and of course I don't know anything near how much you know about this topic, is that electricity is somewhat more solvable problem, but cooking seems to be a much larger and grander problem. So one of the things that I'm thinking about, and if I think about the cooking ladder, and feel free to disagree and correct me if I'm going wrong here, but you start with solid biomass, and then the idea is people can have LPG and gas-based cooking, and then the third ladder and eventual would be like clean electricity-based cooking. I may be wrong, but that's sort of my understanding. So if I were to think that this is the transitional ladder, how does climate change play into this? And now this whole idea of no fossil fuel finance in around the world, like Europe and Canada and a bunch of other countries have come together, and they're talking about that we will not fund like fossil fuel infrastructure around the world and so on. So if I were to call this no finance of new fossil fuel infrastructure, or rather only financing clean infrastructure, how does this externality influence the already grand energy access challenge?
Well, I'd like to answer your question in two parts. I'll come to the electric cooking bit a bit later, but let me take on the second question, which is like, okay, if the if countries are proposing a blanket ban on fossil fuel finance, is it going to affect energy access challenge? And the fact is, yes, renewables are cheaper. And developing countries are, especially India's very, in most certain terms, seizing this opportunity. We have 90 gigawatts of renewables, a fourth of total installed capacity, and we have even grander plans of installing more renewables. But the fact of matter is, these developing countries, they're rising, the energy demand is rising so fast that even with so much renewables, they will still need to rely on fossils to meet the demand, right? Because, and then to give you sort of an example, like, an average Indian household consumes just a tenth of what an average American household consumes. Of course, this is the extreme, but this massive gap sort of reflects, a different form of energy poverty. So, from our survey, for instance, 70% of Indian homes they use electricity only for lighting, running 2 fans, and just one television. That is it. So, all of these households, of course, aspire to a better quality of life so that they can use electricity, for reducing the drudgery associated with cleaning their clothes or cleaning their dishes, and so much more, right? And all of this would happen only when they have access to cheap power. So, and the fact is, as we are pursuing energy transition, investments in renewables, integrating it with the grid, the shift of high income households to the distributed solar, while all of this is great, it costs money and it's making it difficult for power utilities to service poorer households through cheap supply, right? So, even in case of cooking, for instance, or in case of just gas, India plans to expand its city gas distribution network, and so that it can supply cleaner and cheap energy to communities, for transport, for commercial as well as industrial entities. Now, if finance is not available for expanding such infrastructure, it is definitely going to hurt the developing countries' objectives of extending energy access not just to household but for development as a whole. Now, coming to the second part of question, which was like, if electricity is the final ladder of cooking, yes and no, and we don't know for sure, right? So we are still exploring. Again, from our survey, we find that only 5% of Indian households use any kind of electric cooking as of now. And even half of them use it only for occasional purposes, right? And the reason for such slow uptake till now has been, and it's not that electricity is not available. Most urban households have had electricity for decades. But the high cost of electric stove, compatible utensils, the electricity cost itself, and the most importantly, ability to cook all the dishes that you want using those appliances. It's limiting the use of electric cooking in the manner that we have seen in the Western world, I think. And so, while at least in the near future, electricity can supplement LPG, but won't fully replace. So until that happens, to put a blanket ban on fossil fuel consumption in expansion in developing countries, I think it's partly hypocrisy. Yeah.
So this is the part of the conversation where I usually get myself into trouble, because I say things that tend to annoy my environmentalist friends and colleagues. So I'm going to answer a question about this whole issue of climate change and its relationship to energy access by saying there's pretty much no relationship. And the reason I say there's almost no relationship is as follows. If we're talking energy access, and I'm going to distinguish between energy access in low-income countries or emerging economies from energy for broader economic development of those countries. I'm going to start with the energy access piece first. I'm talking about energy access. I'm talking about the billion people without access to electricity, the 2.5 billion people who cook with wood, plus the ones who cook with coal. Okay. Here's a very, very simple back of the envelope calculation. Any of your readers, listeners can do on their own if they're so inclined. If I could wave a magic wand, I could hook up every one of those billion people that have access to electricity to diesel power, about as dirty as you can imagine. Okay? And for that first access to electricity, as Shalu noted, what are people using it for? They're using it for light, maybe a low power television, maybe a fan, maybe, right? These kinds of things. It will add roughly somewhere around 1.5% or so to global CO2 emissions. If I were to take all of those households using biomass and I were to magically give them LPG and have them use it for all of their cooking needs in all these rural areas, and it's a fossil fuel, and oh my God, it's terrible, another 1.5%. All right, so we can solve the energy access problem at about 3% of global CO2 emissions. I am not concerned about it, right? When you think about it from an equity and justice perspective, it's just not an issue as far as I'm concerned. And there's other more sophisticated analyses that have been done, and you can see these numbers, and they all sort of bear out the same thing. Okay, I'll go even one step further. If I'm talking about cooking, and I'm talking about using wood for cooking in inefficient chulas, or even a rocket stove, which I happen to have one sitting behind me for reasons I was for a previous colleague I was just on. Well, sometimes that wood is unsustainably harvested, right? That has a CO2 impact. The burning of that wood in these inefficient stoves releases things like black carbon. That has a major climate impact, right? These short-lived climate forces are in fact things that people are very, very concerned about, okay? If you run the numbers, it's fairly clear that you could, if the sustainability of the wood is not very good, or even if especially if you're looking at the black carbon, you could replace all those wood burning stoves with LPG, a fossil fuel, and you would probably come out breaking even on CO2 or greenhouse gas impacts, right? It's just not there. Now, if we start talking about the development of economies, the growth of industrial infrastructure, the growth of the commercial sector, the growth of a middle class, the eventual movement of these people who need basic energy access into a more consumptive lifestyle in years to come. Now, okay, fine. We can start talking about there's potentially some climate impacts to that, right? But I agree entirely with Shalu. It's hypocrisy to say we're going to stop financing fossil fuels in sub-Saharan Africa or in India or these kinds of places because of the climate impact. And for a whole host of reasons. One is, yes, renewables. This is where I please my environmentalist friends. Renewables are great. There's a lot of reason to deploy renewables, from the small scale in the villages through to large scale into the grid. Lots of great reasons. Climate is not always one of them, right? Cost is certainly one of them. The health effects of the particulate matter is one of them. All these other things are there, right? But the fact of the matter is, when we're talking about many of these economies, there is going to have to be, at least for some period of time, almost certainly some continued modest expansion of fossil fuels, right? And for countries that have used up way more than their fair share of the carbon budget to turn around and say, oops, sorry, we've used it all up, none for you, right? Or even worse, to say, well, if you go down that route that we went down, oh, look, climate change is going to happen and it's going to be the worst for you, right? Because let's not forget, this weaponizing almost of the climate impacts when it comes to the mitigation question is really terrible, right? The idea that if you are in sub-Saharan Africa or you're in India where climate impacts are going to be particularly bad, so therefore you shouldn't use fossil fuels, right? Because we've used up the carbon budget, there's a problem. That doesn't compute, right? So if we have a limited carbon budget to go, we really need to have a conversation about who gets priority access to that carbon budget. And I'll go even further on the hypocrisy front. I'm sitting here living in a country which bought a fossil fuel pipeline, right? If Canada, which have heard rumors of joining this little coalition of countries saying we shouldn't be financing fossil fuels in low-income countries, is buying pipelines and does not, as far as I'm concerned, despite our net zero discussions here in Canada and despite our recent climate action, have a clear path to reducing the fossil fuel industry in this country. There is a really hard sell there for me to say that our government should be saying anything about fossil fuel investments of the type that are needed for developing economies.
That's really great. I mean, I love both your answers. Shalu was a bit more polite, but Hisham just...
Oh, you know me, Sandeep. I have no problem speaking my mind.
That's really, really great. I mean, one question that I want to touch upon, and I would love, maybe Shalu, you can go first and talk about it in the context of your survey or more broadly, and then Hisham. I mean, lots of people love sort of this small scale systems and think about these systems. But is that really aspirational? I mean, yeah, sure, it could work for a little while and it's fine. But at the end of the day, you need energy for growth, right? Like you need good, solid, like sources of energy, which is affordable, reliable, but you need it at scale for much larger industrial development. So, what do you think about these small scale systems? Are they aspirational, and they meeting aspirational needs? And B, is that something we should promote and forget about? The overall larger sort of like development, real development, if I could call them.
I'll keep my answer to this a bit short, but let me try to answer it this way. I think in the context of energy access, when we look at distributed renewables, the suitability and their aspirational value varies from context to context, right? So it depends on what is the kind of household you're talking about, what are their energy needs, what kind of systems can you make available for them, and it's really cheaper than the alternative that they can avail of, right? So in the context of India, because most places have high population densities, extending the grid often made sense, right? And then where it was difficult, the distributed renewables were given. But if you're talking about, of course, I mean, this aspect we have discussed, but I think this question was, more suitable a little while back when the technology wasn't that advanced. The costs have come down significantly. We have much better battery storage coming up, and we are seeing their prices also going down. So even now, even in India, we see farmhouses or even big houses turning towards rooftop solar. I mean, it's just a matter of what you call it: rooftop solar system versus solar home system versus distributed renewables. I mean, this is terminology thing, but I mean, people are turning towards it to cut down their costs, but also to make sure that they have supply when the grid goes off, for instance. So I think the aspirational aspect is constantly being shaped by the evolutions in the technology and pricing that we are seeing. From our survey, we find that the awareness about solar home system is significant. I mean, it's rising, but it's not, always resulting into uptake, because of course there's a lot of inertia. If you don't immediately need a system, you're not going out to figure out how to get it installed on your roof, and there are net metering related issues, that some administrative barriers are there. Those are being resolved, but I think going forward, distributed renewables will also play an important role in making our power system more resilient, in the sense, I mean, we know centralized systems have their limitations. If a grid goes down, everyone goes down with it, for whatever hours, and our demand is becoming variable, our supply is going to become more variable. So having more distributed systems spread across, I mean, it's good for the system, but and I think and it's difficult for us to imagine right now, but going forward, the way we interact with energy, we interact with each other in terms of energy or trade, energy. I mean, all of these aspects are shaping up, and I think the society will change going forward. So DRE potentially would become an integrated part of our society rather than just being an aspirational commodity. So I'll let Hisham share his more perspective on this.
Yeah, I largely agree with you. I think that the way that we see a lot of renewables happening in places like India right now is as what I would say is a transition technology. The question we don't know is what it's going to transition to. So one pathway is that a lot of people get access, or some people get access through solar home systems, microgrids, mini grids, these kinds of things. And that's a temporary solution until the grid is even further extended at some point in time into the future. And then they will no longer, because their incomes have gone up, they can afford more electricity, it becomes worthwhile to extend the grid even further and further and further. And so it's a transition simply until eventually a full grid electrification, much like we've seen in if you go back decades in history for European economies or North America or these kinds of things. There's another potential way in which it's a transition technology, which is more to what Shalu was talking about, in which you have a mixed system of centralized and decentralized that are actually working together in many, many ways, meeting different types of customer demands, depending on what the customer needs, what is willing to pay for. And, because let's face it, here in North America, for example, looking at the United States and places like that, we're seeing a rise of distributed energy for a whole host of reasons and a whole host of purposes. It's not that we don't have a centralized system, right? It's there, right? But we're seeing there's these niche areas and they're growing, and so we're seeing people installing solar systems on their roofs for a whole host of reasons. We're seeing industries, we're seeing larger commercial buildings installing these kinds of things, and part of that is resilience and reliability. Part of that is cost. Part of that is maybe even sort of climate driven. The whole. So it's possible that for places like India, the transition actually moves more into that kind of system, and maybe even more seamlessly in some way. So I don't know which way it's going to transition. The one thing I will note also, though, in thinking about the fact that globally and certainly in India, there's going to be a portion of the population that gets access. If we meet SDG 7, Sustainable Development Goal 7 on universal access by 2030, right? Kind of half are going to get it from the grid and half are going to get it from these various off-grid, mini-grid, solar home system type technologies. What's really interesting, and we've been working on, Vikas Mangwani, who's in the lab of mine and just recently defended. So Dr. Mangwani, I'm happy to say, has been working on this with me and some colleagues at KTH and other places, is a really interesting question, which is, in many parts of the world, and India included, the grid system is subsidized. The tariff you pay does not cover, in many places, especially in rural areas, the cost of actually delivering that electricity. On the other hand, in many places also, renewable off-grid technologies are not subsidized necessarily, right? So let's say we reach 2030 and we have everybody with universal access, but some people got subsidized grid electricity, and some people paid full cost for a solar home system. And these people got subsidized electricity, which is 24/7 and from the grid, and at higher power capacities they can do more with. And these people get a 100-watt solar home system, which is limited, and they paid for the full amount. That is fundamentally a justice question. It's an equity question, right? What does universal access mean, right? Whose responsibility is it? Right. So when we talk about what, aspirational technologies, when we talk about, this mix between decentralized and centralized systems, we also have to get into who's paying for it, what are they getting for it, right? What does it mean for SDG 7? And in particular, in my group, we tend to take sort of a justice, ethics, and equity lens to thinking about those problems.
If I may add a little bit more to it, I think one aspect that we haven't discussed today is the point of energy safety nets. And, it just sort of it came to my mind as we were talking about, how are we going to, do justice to people who have different access to different forms of electricity solutions. And I think right now, of course, the subsidies are linked to the consumption that you're having from the grid connections. And of course, there are, some subsidies given to, at least in India, for rooftop, solar system as well. Of course, there's no certainty, how long both of these will continue. But going forward, we will definitely need to rethink the way energy safety nets can be designed, and they could be de-linked to the kind of energy solution that a household has. And I think that's something that will be very important because, and then of course the question of how much energy subsidy is enough also keeps on changing, right? Probably a few decades back, just having a light bulb would have been good enough to ensure that there's no more energy poverty. As the energy services that a society uses, they increase the base minimum that you want to ensure everyone in the society should have also keeps rising. So now probably if I were to define energy safety net or an energy poverty line, it would be everyone should be able to use at least lights and fans, right? Or probably a TV even. Probably a decade down the line when even more hot, we'll include a fridge also in the definition. So So that keeps changing, but I think it's important that we all keep in mind the role that these safety nets play in ensuring that everyone has access to them. And this question has become very, very important in the current context, because even last year we saw a lot of non-payments to the discoms, power utilities, rising in India, because people lost their jobs or their incomes dropped and they were not able to pay. And now we have a second wave, and of course we're just praying that it goes down soon. But it would just simply reinforce the issue that we saw last year. So it's important that that countries put in place these safety nets for the vulnerable population, so that at least the bare minimum needs are being taken care of, no matter what you use.
That brings us to our last question. It's great that Hisham already has mentioned about SDG 7. Sustainable Development Goals, or SDG 7, established in the UN General Assembly 2015, aim at ensuring access to affordable, reliable, sustainable, and modern energy for all by 2030. So now we have a decade to achieve our SDG 7 goals. I want to ask you both, if you were to make the policy to achieve these goals, what are the top three steps that will be your focus areas? You can talk either about cooking or electricity or both.
Interesting question. I will start by saying that the number one thing I think for me is not a concrete, like it's not this kind of subsidy or that kind of subsidy, or money invested here, money invested there. Those things are necessary. I think for me, and one of the things that I've been trying to push in the various work that I've been doing with Vikas and with Devyani Singh, another former student in the lab, Dr. Singh, and Dr. Abhishek Kaur, who was also in my lab, is that we can think about this as a social contract. This is the way I like to think about it. That the government has a social contract with its people, and energy is part of that social contract, right? That access to energy is part of that social contract. Now, if you accept that premise, then you start to think about, okay, how to organize around that. What are the mechanisms for meeting that social contract? Who are the agents of that social contract? It doesn't have to be the government, right? But the government has to figure out the way to allow those agents to exist and operate, right? And so, again, I'll go back to sort of the North American, European example. We often would have monopoly utility territories. They're private monopoly utilities that have a certain territory, but they're regulated, right? They were the agent of the social contract from the government to the people of having universal access to electricity, right? Same thing can happen in India and other places in terms of thinking about that goal, right? So that's sort of, to me, it's the first place that starts is the principle of that social contract, and how are you going to meet it in a way that's equitable, justice-based, right? And deals with the fact that you have people who can't afford that, and whether that's electricity or that's cooking or whatever, right? That's where I would that's the first thing I would start with. The second is, I would say, there's lots of reasons that subsidies are, considered to be harmful, etc., but subsidies are not bad in this space. You need them to be smart, you need them to be transparent, you need them to be effective and appropriate, and all those kinds of other things. But we have to push back against this idea sometimes that subsidies are inherently distortion. They do distort. We want them to distort. In this case, we want them to distort the market because the market is not working to meet the needs of people, right? So we need to have those subsidies in place. And how we do that, we have to figure out how to do that better. I think there's ways in which India has done that really well and not so well, right? The consumption subsidy is a blanket to everybody. They know that, and then having people have to voluntarily give it up, not so great. I mean, great that it was a consumption subsidy, but obviously it was very inefficient because lots of people were getting it that didn't need it, right? The PMUI, Ujjwala subsidy, has clearly been very effective in increasing the numbers of households with access to LPG. Not that they're necessarily always using it. So there's more work to be done on the behavior change front, on different types of subsidies to help with that. But, so the second piece of that to me is just, we need to allow for the fact that this is a public policy goal for both private and public good, and it's okay for government. And it's not like this didn't happen in the United States or Canada or Europe, right? Go back to the 1930s, go back to the rural electrification program in the United States and the development of the co-ops, right? And this wonderful organization, the National Rural Electricity Cooperatives Association, which I'm a huge fan of, still around, right? Because there's still co-ops around in the United States, right? And go back and look at those lessons of direct support for that goal, right? Because the resources are there. The amount of money necessary to solve the energy access problem from an investment perspective is roughly about 5% of global energy sector investments on an annual basis. The money's there, right? Just gotta figure out how to get it. That'll be my 2 cents.
Right. No, truly agree with Hisham said, and I like the way you put that framework of social contract and who will be the right agents to actually implement the same. And let me share my thoughts on more operational elements, I guess, because the framework is there. And I think, and I'll speak from the perspective of India again. What we need is filling the gaps that remain. There are people who, the population is rising, of course, and there are people who are still without electricity. So we need to think, and make available context-specific and need-based solutions for those households. Because these are really the ones that have sort of been left out of the scheme's coverage. So clearly, it's not, one size fits that will work for them. Secondly, I think we need to definitely, across the board, strengthen our institutions, those which deliver services and those which regulate those who deliver the services. And this is because that's the only way to make sure that we are investing and upgrading our infrastructure, in an efficient manner, constantly monitoring the quality of services that we are providing to the consumers, but also making sure that, part of the value is being recovered while taking care of the vulnerable consumers. Thirdly, I think what we need, especially in the context of developing countries, is to, figure out ways to link how sort of bring it to people's consciousness that how energy use is linked to the environmental and local pollution issues. Because going forward, I think that will be important as, the consumptions rise, and they're going to rise very fast in developing countries. So that people are more amenable to managing their demand, embracing energy efficiency, which I think also sits, very closely within the energy access space, because it allows people to use more services with lower expenses, but also allows, the suppliers to meet the demand without, generating too much. And finally, I think, and this is the thing that we've talked about, that energy access that we've been talking about is mostly for consumptive use. And to make sure that people are able to meet their aspirational needs, we need to constantly invest in creating opportunities for productive purposes. And that's the only way to actually create that virtuous cycle that can decouple energy access issue from the income poverty issue.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more on that last point. I think, this emphasis that we've continually see on again, I said this before, how many households has really led us astray, I think, in many ways, right? Because it's created this energy access on this side and energy for development kind of over here, and not, thought about what are the bigger forces at play, and then it gets to the whole question around the environmental side of things. And the renewables, like I said, I don't think this whole question is a matter for this basic energy access problem, but it is a big deal for the energy for development piece of it. And so thinking through how we look at what those pathways are, with a development first lens on it, recognizing that there's lots of really great reasons to go for those renewable energy technologies in that development first approach, but it gets torqued if it becomes sort of the climate first approach, and then development is an ancillary benefit, right? You know, that's where I feel we get into some troubles, and more so when you start moving down to the energy access space.
Well, thank you so much. I mean, I think that's a great way to sort of end this fascinating episode.
This was an enlightening discussion. A big thanks to both of you for joining us today in this very important and special episode. Stay safe and healthy. Thank you.
For more information about the podcast, visit us online at www.101reporters.com/podcast/the_India_energy_hour. You can also reach out to us on social media and send us your comments and suggestions. My Twitter handle is at Sandeep Pai with a double I, and Shreya's Twitter handle is at Shreya_J.